Well, thank you, George. This is a great honor and a wonderful event, and I don't believe I've ever worn so much hardware in my life. So I came here with a group of students. It came to Portugal in 1976. It was a remarkable thing. I think we have to, let me just say that was when I first met George, of course, and became friends. It was at the special request of José da Silva Lopes, who was an extraordinary. He was the man that Portugal needed at its central bank at that moment. It was a time of great stress. There was remarkable pessimism elsewhere in the world, including in the United States, about whether Portugal's new democracy would actually survive that stress. It did. And I think that's a memory to bring hope to all of us in these renewed difficult times, which we will all do our best to lead to an eventual happy ending. And I actually told, we met some people from the Banco de Portugal, and I told them that I was planning to come and celebrate the successful transition through this crisis when I visited Portugal 35 years from now. I am going to talk. The title of the talk that I gave to the organizers was "Economics and the Crisis," and this is going to be, at least in the talk, we can have questions afterwards. But my goal in this talk is not to discuss so much the specific policies that need to be followed here, or more importantly in Europe as a whole, as to talk about my profession. This is a moment, I think, of when we should be doing some soul searching. And economists have reached a moment where they are very much needed. This is the kind of situation for which our profession was made. This is when we can really make a difference. And have not, I'm sorry to say, done all that we might have asked. Quite a ways from it, actually. And what I'm going to do in this talk is first talk a little bit about why it is actually moments of crisis when economics is or should be most useful. The ways in which we have actually not been as useful as we should have been. And then some of the reasons why, and maybe what we can do so this doesn't happen again. So economics, most of the time you're dealing with a more or less stable world. Most of the time you're dealing with a situation in which this year is not very different from last year, in which there are repetitive patterns, in which the ordinary business of running the economy goes on with gradual changes, because we live in dynamic economies, but the changes are gradual. Those are the times when economic analysis seems to work best. It's also the times when it is probably least useful. If the economy is functioning more or less as it should, and things are rolling along, who needs economists? Okay, now that's not entirely fair. There are clearly always going to be things that you're going to want good analysis. You're going to want to know how can you improve the effectiveness of government programs. You're going to want better tools for short-run forecasting. There's always going to be a need for people who can advise on how to make better use of water resources, or better schemes for environmental protection, or all the many other things that economists work on. And in fact, I guess you could say that much of what economists do, microeconomics, the study of small things, is something which is more or less equally relevant at all times. But macroeconomics, the study of big things, is not much needed if the economy is calm. And in fact, at times like those, the economist is often at a disadvantage compared with people who may have less technical skill, at least of their kind, with people who don't think in terms of economic models, but who have experience. If it's a normal situation and you want You want to know what's likely to happen to interest rates next year. Or you want to know even the effect of a policy. What will happen if the government goes and privatizes some assets, whatever. It's probably, I have to say, much as it's not what I would like to say, that you're probably better off talking to someone who is a man of the world, someone who's been out there in the markets and has experience and has seen situations like this 10 times, 15 times in his or her life, and knows from experience from what's likely to happen. So yeah, I mean, fine, we can be economists in normal times, and it can be quite comfortable, but it's not all that important for the world. And you can have an economy that works fine with very little in the way of economic analysis going on at the levels of policy. Now move to a time when things are massively in disarray, a time when markets are behaving in ways that are completely out of the normal experience, a time when economies are more deeply depressed than they've been in 3 generations, or when the financial system is disrupted in a way that hardly anyone living remembers. Those are times when economists are likely to feel very bad about their ability to track events. There are times when economists are likely to make a number of very, very wrong forecasts because the world is not behaving according to expectations. But it's also a time when the economist is most useful, because those are the times when hard thought, when abstract models that are obviously based on reality but simplify that reality to get at some underlying principles, that's the time when economic analysis really matters. In a normal year, 2004, 2005, if you ask someone who's spent his life in investment banking what's likely to happen to interest rates next year, he's probably going to have a pretty good answer, and he may well have a better answer than someone who is steeped in economic theory. If you look at a time like 2009 or 2010 or 2011, or at least so far 2012, when the world looks nothing like the way it normally looks, then that practical, experienced person is likely to have not a clue, because he's never seen anything like this. And in fact, nobody has seen anything like this, not for 70 or 80 years, but with some luck and some hard work, the economist who has studied the underlying forces and maybe should be studied deep into economic history, has something really to contribute. So these are the times, to overstate a bit, but these are the times for which my profession was made. This is when we are supposed to be useful. Unfortunately, I don't think we've actually mostly delivered on that. And it's actually been quite horrifying for me to watch the failure of the profession to rise to the challenge in this moment of great need. And let me spend a minute. Let me give you an example, which I've already hinted at, of the kind of thing I'm talking about. I spend a lot of time talking these days about interest rates, because I think they are the place where the importance of having a model, of doing the kinds of things that economists do, has become clearest. Where are we now? In the major advanced economies, not here because you have a special problem, which I think we'll come to a bit later on, and certainly in questions, but in the United States, in the United Kingdom, in Germany, Japan, we have a situation which is more or less unprecedented. Now, nothing is actually unprecedented. Everything takes place. Everything has taken place in some version before. Probably, if we could, it's probably all in the writings of Ibn Khaldun or something, but it certainly hasn't taken place for a long time. We have a situation of economies that are very depressed, so depressed that the central bankers have cut the interest rates they can control to 0, and it's not enough. So the economies remain depressed despite 0 interest rates. We're also in a situation of unprecedented peacetime budget deficits. Normally, only in times of war do you get to deficits that are anywhere close to 10% of GDP, and here we are with deficits that are enormous. So what is going to happen to interest rates? What's going to happen in particular to longer-term interest rates under these conditions? Well, people who were experienced in the markets, practical men, people who had long worked in the markets, they had a very clear answer. Interest rates are supply and demand for funds. If we're going to be in a situation where where there's someone coming onto the market needs to borrow vast sums, then interest rates are going to shoot up. And I'm not just putting words in their mouth, this was actually something that you could see a forecast that was being made. You could see that big investment houses like Morgan Stanley in late 2009 predict a sharp rise in US interest rates over the course of 2010. Later on, PIMCO, the giant bond trader, made a similar forecast for 2011. All made perfect sense unless you knew macroeconomic modeling, in which case you said, hey, wait, this is a special situation. This is not like a normal year. This is a situation in which the economy is depressed, in which interest rates are, the short-term interest rate that the Fed controls is flat up against zero. There are a lot of different ways to think about that. The jargon phrase is the liquidity trap. But one way to think about it is that this is a world in which collectively people around the world want to save more than collectively people around the world are willing to invest, even at a zero interest rate. And in a world that basically has a lot of savings with no place to go, government budget deficits are not going to drive up interest rates. And so we had a contrast between this abstract, badly dressed academics versus Wall Street bankers with excellent tailors and lots of experience. Well, we know who was right? It turns out that the modelers were right. So the economics told you what you needed to know, and economics was a much, much better guide to this than the ordinary experience of practical people. So this is where economists could be really useful. Okay. We also, I actually meant to take a moment about the Queen's question, so the Queen asked the question, why didn't you guys see this coming? In a lot of ways, I think that was the wrong question. Clearly, nobody can reasonably have been expected to say that Lehman Brothers would collapse on September 15, 2008, right? No, that's a level. I don't think it was even reasonable for anyone to forecast a financial crisis in 2008. But what we should have known as a profession is that something like this was possible. And we should have seen that the risks of it were rising. So this is the point where, again, economics, we had the tools. We had what was needed. We should have remembered the work of great economists of the past. We should have remembered the work of the great American economist Irving Fisher, who warned about the dangers of excessive debt and how you can get into a spiral where everyone is trying to pay down debt, and their combined efforts to pay down debt actually make their debt problems worse. We should have been aware of the work of John Maynard Keynes, who'd warned about the possibility of the economy being caught in a sustained period of weakness, not collapse, but no recovery either. So this is something we should have known was coming, something we should have been prepared for, and we were not. There were very few warnings that something like this was in the offing. But even worse, the profession should have been ready with answers, with things to do. Because these are not mysterious phenomena. These are, although they come once every 3 generations, they were studied. We did learn about them. We should have had a ready response. The profession should have spoken mostly with one voice about what to do in these times. And this matters, by the way. You might say, well, what does it matter what academics say? Well, there are a couple of answers to that. One is if you actually ever read John Maynard Keynes, his book ends with this wonderful passage about the importance of ideas. saying that that ideas, not vested interests, are what are dangerous for good or evil. I don't know if that works through translation, but it's a wonderful phrase in English, that it's ideas that matter, that academics, in fact, have a large influence, he thought, over the longer run. But in fact, it matters a lot even in the shorter run. A friend of mine, the political scientist Henry Farrell, has been tracking policy responses and trying to analyze why there was a general move towards stimulus in the immediate aftermath of the financial crisis, immediately after Lehman fell, and why that gave way to austerity policies about a year later. And his answer, based on a lot of research, is that in the initial impact of the crisis, the economics profession did appear to speak with one voice. That if you actually ask what economists were telling policymakers they should be doing, those economists who were speaking up very much were in accord that it was urgent for governments to support their economies. But by sometime into late 2009, that had given way to a cacophony of voices. That there were people saying everything, and prestigious people, not just that you can always find someone in the world of professors to say anything, but that there were many prestigious people saying the opposite of what people like me were saying. The timing, by the way, is a little interesting. His point is that it's not so much that there was ever that much unanimity, but rather that the economists who routinely concern themselves with government policy did pretty much agree on what needed to be done, and they were ready to speak up right away. But over time, those economists who were more distant from actual policy making, mostly because they tend to be opposed to policy making, found their voices. And their voices turned what had been a harmony into a discord. And the result was to open the door for politicians to basically do whatever suited their feelings, whatever suited their sense, which in many cases meant that they turned their backs on the issue of job creation, turned their backs on the necessity of trying to maintain a forward motion in the economy, and ended up producing a great deal of damage. The question you would ask then is, how did this happen? It's a really agonizing question, because it's not simply that we had differences of views. That can happen. That's going to happen. It's going to happen even in the most scrupulous of sciences. What happened in economics instead was something more disturbing, because it wasn't so much that we had people who had developed new ideas that effectively challenged old orthodoxies, as that we had people who had completely forgotten things that the profession used to know. It's very clear to me when I look at the scene that if we had had this current crisis in around 1970, that we would have had a much more unanimous and effective response from economists to what should be done than we actually did. And that we would have had a better response of politicians because of that better response from the economists. That in very important ways we had intellectual retrogression, that we were stupider, if you like, in our ability to deal with economic crisis in the year 2010 than we would have been if the same crisis had presented itself to us in 1970. And you may ask, who am I to say that? Well, I paid some attention to this thing and looked at it. But more to the point, when we actually look at the arguments that were presented for not having government spending to fight the recession, for not having a policy of monetary expansion to fight the slump, you look at those and you see that there were very few frontier arguments. There were very few arguments that came from an expanded insight into the way the economy works. Instead, you had, to an amazing extent, people making arguments that were 80 years old, arguments that were the same arguments that the opponents of action made in 1931 or 1932, and of course arguments that had been refuted very thoroughly in the economic debate that took place in the 1930s So why did these people, a lot of them were at the University of Chicago, they're not all of them, why did some famous economists from the University of Chicago resurrect 80-year-old fallacies in the midst of this great crisis? And the answer was they didn't know that they were 80-year-old fallacies. They were unaware that those discussions had ever taken place. They'd forgotten the whole history of thought, the whole history of thought about how depressions happen and what you can do to fight them. Okay, something went terribly, terribly wrong with the economics profession, with, I believe, large consequences, large real negative consequences for the real world. That to some extent you might say that the pain that's afflicting the unemployed in the United States and in much of Europe is at least in part due to the failure of the economics profession. So how did that happen? Georges Braga de Macedo has said a bit about that already. We had a great division that took place in economics. It started for honorable reasons, let me say. It began when, in the face of, basically in the face of intellectual issues, some economists began trying to look deeper. And this gets a little more technical probably than I should, but the prevailing Keynesian view of the economy that flourished in the 1960s was one that had some loose ends hanging. We normally think that in economics, we normally think that in markets, if there's more supply than demand, the price falls. And that this eventually matches supply and demand. But when we turn to the economy as a whole, we normally accept the notion that if you have high unemployment, wages fall maybe, but very slowly. There's not a lot of movement. And this is an observed fact, but it's not that easy to explain why. And so there was research, which is perfectly okay, trying to understand why this might be the case. And there were some attempts to explain it, which were very clever and very attractive. And as George mentioned already, freshwater economics, that really emerged in full just about the time that I was in graduate school. And I remember how exciting it was and how much we all thought, hey, this is really interesting, clever stuff. Plus it uses some fancy mathematics, which is always a good thing. And so people were attracted to it. Okay, that happens. That's normal in any science. What is not okay was that the people who were taking these new approaches decided that they had the truth, big letters, the truth, and that anything anyone else said was false and not to be paid attention to. And they took that position and basically ruled out everything that had gone before without waiting to see whether their approach actually worked. And by about 1980, it was already clear that their approach did not work, but by then it was too late. They had burned their bridges. And what we got then was a division of economics. This is something that sounds so, in the academy, why does it matter? But it has huge consequences for the real world. We had a division in which a large part of economics just turned inward. I'm tempted to say became almost a kind of cult, in which only their view was true, in which contrary evidence was not to be looked at, and which people who offered alternative views were not to be listened to. You might say, well, isn't my side a cult too? I think we can say objectively that that's not true. I think we can say that people so the division was between the two flavors of water. Fresh water, it just happened that the schools that had one point of view tended to be on the coasts of the United States, Yale, Princeton, Harvard, MIT, and that the other school tended to be in the middle, Chicago, Minneapolis. But the saltwater people continued to pay attention to the other side, to read their papers. If you ask a Princeton graduate student, what would somebody at Chicago say about this? That student can do it. If you ask, even actually Chicago is relatively brackish. Minneapolis, what would somebody at the University of Minnesota say about this? A Princeton student can do it. If you ask somebody at Minnesota, what would a Princeton student say about this? He has no idea. Because we're heathens, and therefore our views are not to be considered. Kind of a runaway, if you like, a sort of runaway. I mean, it sounds petty, it sounds academic, but it was a runaway process. And when the crisis struck, well, people who consult with central banks, people who, or actually go to work at central banks, tend to be from the more activist view of economic policy. But because after all, if you don't think that there's any useful role for active policy, why would you be going off to a policy-making institution? So in the initial flush after the crisis, relatively activist ideas were what you heard from economists, because the others were having a little time finding their voices. But then, after about a year, they came in strong, and the result was as I said, a cacophony of voices. All unity on economic issues was lost, which left, I'm sorry to say, left the politicians and the people in positions of actual power to believe whatever they wanted to believe. And what they wanted to believe was very, very wrong. In Europe especially, the United States is, when we talk about economic policy, there is a kind of a competition between Europe and the United States to see who can do a worse job at actually responding to this crisis. Kind of a race to the bottom between the two sides. And in our case, that's in the United States, that's driven very largely, it's driven in part by mistakes on the part of the current administration. It's driven to an important extent by the fact that a number of people in the United States share the intellectual sins of the Europeans, which I'll get to in a moment. But it's also driven by our intense partisanship. So in the United States, if I believe that if the Republican Party were convinced that I was right about what we should be doing about the economy, they would insist that we actually do the opposite, at least until somebody else is in the White House. But in Europe, it's less that. It is that views that were views that suited the temperament of policy officials, rather than than views that actually either were logically coherent or, more important, fitted the historical evidence, took over. And so what you saw on the European side was, particularly in 2010, which I view as the year when it all went wrong, we saw a takeover of economic discourse by views that were primarily, I guess I'd say, driven by economics as morality. You cannot, you can talk to officials, particularly in Germany, but not only in Germany, about this crisis, and it's all about you have sinned and you must pay the penalty for sin. They know that excessive government deficits were the problem and have caused the crisis. And no amount of evidence to the contrary, no matter how many times you point out that Spain was actually running a budget surplus, that Ireland was actually running a budget surplus, that Portugal, although not good, was not remotely as irresponsible as Greece. That nonetheless, for them, it's all Greek. Everyone is Greece, and that the story that you're all Greece is the problem, and the solution is simply to suffer because of the virtues of suffering. And you really have to listen. My wife is up here laughing. We had the experience of watching close-up speech by Wolfgang Schäuble, the German finance minister, who I think is a good human being, but his view, boy, he wants fire and brimstone. Um, and there was all of this coupled with the view that somehow virtue would automatically be rewarded. That if you only were sufficiently convincing in your commitment to austerity, that the result would be, in fact, economic bliss. The doctrine of expansionary austerity that became so popular and was adopted, I mean, not just by a few people, but essentially adopted by the European Central Bank, and of course the current government of Britain as well. And for all of this, I blame the economists. Because although, yes, of course, politicians will believe what politicians want to believe up to a point, but there's a reason why we expect a 21st century politician to be better in making economic policy than Herbert Hoover or Heinrich Brüning. And the reason we expect them to be better is that we believe that economic science has progressed and can tell them better. But when half the economists yell the opposite of what the people who actually know something about the 1930s have to say, why should you expect anything better from the political side? This is not a happy thing for me to say. I mean, it's obviously there are terrible things happening in the real world, and we do our best to argue for better policies. But what's particularly disturbing is that I've devoted my life to trying to make economics, to advance economics, to make our understanding better. And yet here we have a situation where in the moment of need, the economics profession was useless, or maybe worse than useless, because it had gotten so caught up in its internal struggle for prestige, for getting ahead, for marking yourself out as being part of the right tribe, that it was not available to provide useful advice in the moment of crisis. Well, what do we do? Well, first of all, while the economics profession sorts itself out, the real world needs to be fixed. And I think every economist who has some, every economist who can needs to weigh in and try to move policy in the right direction. This is not a time to keep quiet in the ivory tower and say, well, I'm just doing my research. This is a time when the lives of tens of millions of people are at stake, and we need to push for the right policies. And maybe we can make some progress on that front. But it's also a time for the profession of economics to do some really major soul searching. I believe that with the passage of a little bit of time, it will become clear that how badly things went off course, that the people who've been so wrong in this crisis, well, they themselves will never acknowledge it. Actually, I've been a newspaper columnist now for more than a decade, and my experience is that nobody ever admits that they were wrong about anything. So no one will actually admit that they were wrong, but the next generation can come along, and generations, more like the next cohort. And if I can say something optimistic about economics, this actually is a golden age of empirical, fact-based research by young economists. There's wonderful work being done now, and maybe that will become the norm. But we're going to have to look really hard at how we went so far off course in this crisis so that we do better for the next crisis. Because although at this point it may seem as if this crisis will never end, it will eventually, but there will be another one. There always is. And let's hope that my profession is better prepared to deal with it when it comes. Thank you.